Hi, this is Maggie Sue, and here's my presentation on my paper, Empowerment and Not Victimization, a qualitative analysis on how to include more women in architecture. So before I get started on my paper, I just want to introduce my abstract here, which you can skim over while I highlight some key points. This paper ultimately explores the need for more women to be involved in the design process, and as of now, a way to alleviate this imbalance. Ultimately, I achieve this by comparing current working frameworks in the field with failed ones in the past. Throughout the process, I discovered that in order to actually help women out, designers need to start treating them as individuals to be empowered rather than victims to be helped. And this leads me to the introduction. According to a 2020 report written by the American Institute of Architecture, only 17% of registered architects are women. While this underrepresentation undoubtedly affects the women working inside the field, the impacts of this phallocentrism also echoes throughout the everyday lives of people who interact with the designed environment all over the world. Just as an example, in post-World War towns in the UK, the designs are very car-centered and pub-centered. And especially in a time where women couldn't drive, this is especially restricting to them as they couldn't travel much anywhere. And it was also very inconvenient because rather than having childcare centers, there were pubs around um, within walking distance, which was a lot more helpful to men during that time than women. And a more recent example is in the new town of Eureka, where in an effort to rebuild the town, women were largely ignored during the design process. And what resulted, the researchers found, was that the women in the new town had decreased access to both public spaces and education after re-entering life in this new town. And lastly, in the US, when colleges opened up to women in the 1960s and 70s, they lacked female bathrooms. And that obviously, even though the move to open up colleges to women was supposed to make them feel more welcomed and opening, and this overlooking of bathrooms served as a fact to remind them that they still did not fully belong. Evidently, a diversity of perspectives is essential in successfully creating an inclusive environment, but in order to ensure this outcome, we must ask two questions. How should we approach incorporating more women into the field of architecture, and how can architecture be used to heighten women's quality of life? In this piece, I argue that to ensure an inclusive environment, designers need to implement solutions that fix the root of the problem and not just the symptoms. And this leads me to my thesis. Here I argue that it is important to stop perceiving women as victims and start viewing them as individuals with unique aspirations in order to promote them both inside and using the field of architecture. Before we can move on to fully analyzing the thesis, however, we must first understand how something as seemingly objective as architecture can legitimize so much harm. So in this section, part 1A, biased and seemingly subjective fields, I will be drawing from scholars' discussion of the subjective components of other ostensibly objective things such as technology and science to examine architecture as culturally inflected. So first, I will be starting with technology. So according to a National Institute of Standards and Technology report, U.S. developed algorithms show much higher rates of error in identifying the faces of peoples of colors, with error rates going up as much as 100 times more inaccurate. But one question you may ask is, how can code be racialized? MIT Media Lab researcher Joy Bulawini explains that this occurs because engineers in the US who are predominantly white often incorporate their own biases into the code they create. Another 2010 NIST study corroborates this theory and found that while algorithms in the US recognize Caucasian faces more accurately, algorithms developed in East Asian countries such as China, Japan, and South Korea found more success in recognizing East Asian faces. And in this case, the faultiness of facial algorithms has major implications in the US because it is used by 19 out of 24 government agencies. And this can be especially troublesome for those looking for housing or employment from the U.S. Custom and Border Protections. And this can also poses a risk for fundamental human rights, as well as democracy in general, according to Irene Nestorova of the University of Latvia. As a result, a few U.S. cities have banned the use of facial recognition technology in the government, and the Federal Trade Commission was passed to regulate facial recognition companies. Meanwhile, in the case of science, cultural norms also influence how scientists interpret their work. In a thought-provoking paper, anthropologist Emily Martin demonstrates how this inherent bias has impacts on the findings of scientific studies. Conventionally, science textbooks portray the sperm as aggressive penetrators and the egg as the damsel in distress. Upon further digging, however, she unearths that the sperm actually has extremely weak forward thrusts and tend to pry itself off the egg, therefore disproving the prevalent assumption. While in this case, the impact of this distorted finding may not have a very big impact. The tainting influence of ideological biases in science can have deadly outcomes sometimes. For instance, in the 1950s, when the tobacco industries commissioned scientists to research cigarettes and their impact on health, the results that the scientists found reflected what they wanted to be true instead of the actual truth, thus endangering a lot of unassuming people. The previous cases reinforce how seemingly subjective topics are still in the eyes of the beholder, warning us of the trouble an undiverse industry can engender, especially in a field as impactful as architecture, which I will prove in this section. The big impacts of small details in architecture. So, according to Justin Hollander, the brain is like an iceberg, and that we are aware of less than 5% of our responses to our environment. Aware of this strong effect, architects have utilized small details such as nature and color to make a big impact on people's well-beings. Just as an example, after the Massachusetts General Hospital made a significant investment in a garden, researchers found that the recovery rates of patients with a view of the green space went up significantly. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, jail cells are being painted bubblegum pink because, according to psychologists Daniela Spath, through color alone, law enforcement authorities can dampen emotions such as anger and other negative ones too. And a police spokesman confirms this claim, and so now at least 20% of Swiss prisons have pink rooms, and the practice has spread to other countries as well. So I think the previous few parts demonstrate the big impacts a small change in architecture can have, and also how easily it can be tainted by the biases of its own human creators. Thus, I think it's extremely important that designers become more aware of what they're doing, and in this part, I will be analyzing the shortcomings of traditional feminist architecture. Although there are fewer conversations about the place of feminism in architecture today than there were in previous historical moments, the insight of feminist architecture and architects remain important. However, as Mary McLeod, professor of architecture at Columbia University, argues, we need to reflect and re-examine its methods and premises so that the movement portrays women architects in a more accurate light. Starting in the 1970s and 80s, when the feminist movement started to gain traction, numerous pieces of media portrayed women architects as helpless victims in order to spur others to fight against the sexual inequities in the profession. For instance, E1027, widely regarded as one of the cornerstones of modern architecture, was designed by Eileen Gray, but it was wrongfully attributed to the architect Le Corbusier, and thanks to the efforts of the feminists during that time, the credit was given back to Eileen Gray. But although this approach worked, the feminist architects overlooked the philosophy E1027 held in favor of describing Le Corbusier's vandalism, and this unintentionally gives the power back to Le Corbusier and takes the voice away from Gray herself. Many other famous women architects also disagree with this characterization, insisting that their genders should not play a role in their identities as an architect. Perriand, for example, was furious upon hearing architectural historian Beatrice Colomina's claim that Le Corbusier and Jeanneret denied her authorship and creative vision, and revealed that despite Le Corbusier's notorious sexist reputation, his studio was a place where women architects chose to work and were treated as equals. In another case, when Zaha Hadid designed a stadium inspired by the works of feminist artist Judith Baca, many news articles claimed that instead that she was empowering women by making the structure resemble a vagina, an association Hadid called childish. As Hadid's feelings make clear, not all women architects, even those inspired by fellow feminists, want their work reduced to a single body part. While Perriand and Hadid's experience may not reflect that of all female architects, they reveal the limits of framework rooted in victimization. It is important, they suggest, not to let the sexism women architects face obscure their accomplishments, as all too often female architects are defined by their experiences of sexism rather than their own work. Unfortunately, while it takes time to effectively reform the traditional feminist perspective in architecture, women are still being negatively affected by the impacts of the lack of diversity in the field. So how can we more immediately resolve some of these issues? As urban planner Marta Fonseca and Salinas and Sara Ortiz Escalante points out, to ignore the inherent biases of design is to ignore diversity in our society based on gender, origin, social class, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and more. Thus, it is important, especially in the straight, white, male-dominated field of architecture, to have frameworks in which minorities can influence the design process. So in order to answer this question, I will be examining some successful frameworks such as the ADA, school environment regulations, and also the smaller organization of PISR. And so the ADA, also known as the Americans with Disabilities Act, is one of the most well-known frameworks and has functioned to make many people aware of the need for spaces to be conceptualized and built in non-ableist ways. And it has also had a very unarguably positive impact on people with disabilities all over the U.S. And a study conducted by the University of Texas Health Center corroborates this, and as they have found that more than 2/3 of individuals with disabilities believe that ADA is one of the most significant pieces of legislation that has influenced their lives in the past 25 years. And another study found that around 60% of the respondents also believe that the built environment has become a lot more accessible since the ADA, and as a result, it has become easier for a person with disabilities to become part of the community. And lastly, according to Andres Gallegos, who is part of the National Council on Disability, ADA has allowed people with disabilities to be independent of social programs, and this allows them the opportunity to pursue their own goals. And ADA is just an example of how architecture can successfully champion social equality through thoughtfully accessible designs. In another extensively researched case, architects have explored ways to make the school environment more suitable for students. So, in one study, researchers found that just by having more daylighted classrooms, students scored significantly higher and progressed faster on tests. And this impact is equal to that of switching around teachers. And according to an architect that I interviewed, Julie Leary, who specializes in K-12 education, factors such as hallway width and glass doors can also greatly affect the psychology of students. Despite their successes, however, these broad frameworks are not all-encompassing and can sometimes overlook the individual needs of a smaller community. Thus, sometimes minority groups band together to form organizations like PISR, which stands for People in Search of Safe and Accessible Restrooms. PISR was formed when students and professors at the University of Berkeley noticed that the bathrooms there were growing increasingly inaccessible to non-gender conforming people and also people with disabilities. So the group assembled together multiple times and met and brainstormed ways to make the bathrooms more inclusive. In the end, the group created a checklist that contained criteria like the location of tampon or pad dispensers and type of doorknobs to regard bathrooms through a more physical and political lens. And one of the reasons why the solution was so effective was because the solution involved the input of the target demographics in question, which made it a lot more thoughtful and inclusive. In Part 3B, Unsuccessful Solutions, I will be analyzing some solutions to make a more inclusive environment that weren't as successful and why. In these particular cases that I'm going to bring up, they're going to be more gender specific because I think it's important to analyze what people have done wrong in the past to learn what we should do in the future about this problem. So though not as spotlighted as the other issues, urbanists have tried numerous approaches to gender-neutral planning. In the 1990s, for example, upon discovering that boys were much more likely to go to parks than girls after the age of 9, Vienna city planners decided to add in more female-appealing features in the park, such as park benches and volleyball courts. Though thoughtful, the project failed to address the root of the problem and instead only fixed a side effect, creating a more gender-segregated park. In another case, attempting to make women feel safer in cities by adding more walls and hedges to prevent attackers, urbanists instead discourage women from using these spaces because of the confining nature of the resulting design. And the shortcomings of this project could be easily fixed if they had involved the target demographic in question, like PISR did, more in the design process. And this would fix not just the manifestations of the problem but the roots of the problem, which may seem less obvious to people outside of women. In part 4 of my presentation, I just want to introduce 2 clauses that I came up with after analyzing the cases above. So what I found was to effectively reduce gender inequality, designs need to be more conscious of 1, how women function in a particular space, and 2, provide them enablement instead of charity by addressing the root of the problem. Illustrating the first clause, architect Mariam Kamara's mobile loitering, which responds to needs in Niger's highly gendered urban context, considers how women behave in the city. After examination, Kamara discovered that young girls used the tactic mobile loitering to talk to one another publicly in an increasingly conservative city. And another study corroborates that loitering helps women reclaim the city by offering them a safe space outside of their private homes to talk. And keeping this tactic in mind, Kamara ultimately came up with a design that interlinks the solution with this behavior, linking public spaces used by young people and adding programs along the routes to give young girls a reason to be outside and mobile loiter. And meanwhile, the grassroots campaign Mother Centers represents how the second clause can be used. Originating in Germany, this initiative aims to build social infrastructure through self-managed centers where women are paid hourly to manage the many resources like job training and drop-in childcare offered. And this design not only fosters a sense of empowerment by allowing women to advocate for themselves, but it also provides a self-sustaining solution to the root of the problem. This leads me to my conclusion. Today, the unconsciously phallocentric designs in architecture, even those that were meant to mollify the problem, signal towards the need to diversify the industry. To do so, I argue that we need to revise our current approach, which promotes the victimization of women rather than the empowerment of them. First, in order to examine the causes of this problem, I paralleled the relatively few cases of feminist studies with the much more well-covered cases in similar fields such as the technology industries. And then review previous attempts in trying to make a more woman-inclusive city and their shortcomings, which is that most address the symptoms of the problem instead of their roots. And then I compare these to working solutions to other problems, such as the ADA and smaller scale projects that have successfully helped women in their respective regions. Although addressing wildly different concerns, these successful frameworks all share one thing in common: the inclusion of the target audience in the design process and a long-term solution that focuses on people as individuals with unique aspirations. Thus, to successfully include more women in the field and create more gender-inclusive designs, we must start with the crucial step of revising our current perception of women. And here is my works cited page, and note that these are not annotated for the sake of fitting them all in, but I do have a copy of an annotated one if needed. Thank you for listening.